Good afternoon. My name is Regina Begay Roanhorse, and I'm a court administrator with the Navajo Nation Judicial Branch. I am Dene I live in Tuajale, New Mexico, and I also work in Arizona, and I do a lot of work with off-reservation treatment courts. Ray, turning over to you.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ray. I'm a member of the Navajo Nation also, and work out of the New Mexico area. And I'm a veteran of the U.S. Army, and currently working as a behavioral health consultant across Native country. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. And I'm Andrea Seilstead. I am reaching you from Dayton, Ohio. I teach at University of Dayton Law School and direct a clinical program where we do a number of things, including have a program with a collaborative program at the Veterans Administration with veterans located here. I go way back with Regina. We worked as prosecutor and public defender in part of the Eastern Navajo Agency should I say, Regina, in the early 90s. And I've been acquainted with Raymond over the last couple of years on this project. And we're very happy for you to join us. We are working in consultation with the National American Indian Court Judges Association, who has received a number of grants, but one in particular that we've been working on through the Bureau of Justice Assistance, which is part of the Department of Justice, to provide technical assistance and training for strengthening the capacity and quality of indigent defense systems and representation. And our particular project is one focused on American Indian and Alaska Native veterans. We have been working for a while on a number of aspects of the project. The end goal is to create some kind of a legal clinic, but we along the way are doing a number of webinars, some in collaboration with TLPI and some on our own, and generating online resources on this topic. With respect to the goal of the legal clinics, we're in the process and about to have some roundtable discussions to hone in on one or more models that might be effective. And some of the ones that we've been assessing have been medical legal partnerships to work with either the Veterans Administration or a tribal health program or the Indian Health Service, connecting legal services in that model in a collaborative way. We've been looking at programs, existing legal services programs and law school clinical programs, and some collaborations that could be done to leverage resources in that direction. There are some pro bono programs, including one in New Mexico, sponsored by the Young Lawyers Division of the Bar Association, that provides legal counsel and advice specific to veterans. We're looking at that as a model. And then there's some other things, community education, pro se litigation. And at the end of the day, we're looking at some examples where we might generate some on the ground geographically specific clinics, as well as something maybe that spans across jurisdictions that would address a specific legal need for this group of people. So our presentation today is ambitious, so we want to get to the heart of things. We will first talk a little bit about what some of the legal needs are and some of the foundational issues are with respect to this intersection of American Indian, Alaska Native people who are also veterans. We'll do some insights about some considerations that would be necessary for anyone who would like to work with this group of people in terms of cultural background, gender, military experience, and some of the unique issues about transitioning back from military into civilian life. Raymond will spend some time talking about that, as will Regina, and then Regina will end with a specific case study with some of the work she's done with veterans organizations in the Navajo Nation, trying to develop a veterans treatment court. So, and then we'll try to have some time for some questions and answers. I will say, if you want to type your questions now, that's fine. We'll probably try to answer them at the end of the presentation. Okay, so let me cut to the chase on some of my framing points. One key point is that's very significant about the topic of Native American veterans is that from the very beginning of the United States, like from the American Revolution, through every military incursion and humanitarian and peacekeeping missions as well, we have to keep in mind. American Indian and Alaska Natives have served in the military in significant ways. And when you look at studies, the early statistics are hard to measure in exact numbers because even the classification of American Indian or Alaska Native wasn't necessarily specifically tracked. Sometimes they were classified as Black, sometimes white, sometimes other, in different military time periods. And now we have this issue of multiracial categories and other, which may also mask people who share Native American identity. But whatever the actual numbers are, as one scholar has said about the topic, the lack of precise demographic records, should not obscure the bigger picture that Native Americans have demonstrated and continue to demonstrate an abiding devotion to military service. Here's just some numerical figures going through the different major military operations. Both men and women have served significantly in all of the major operations and wars. They continue to serve in more recent times, including in peacetime missions. And one thing I wanted to highlight, I also teach a class on civil rights, and we looked a lot on voting this particular semester. So I have recently looked at this issue, but I think it's particularly significant when you're talking about this issue that American Indians were not granted citizenship and the right to vote in federal elections, including that would shape the policy about going to war and what's the national policy going to be or international policy going to be of the United States. They weren't granted that as a group until 1924. There were different pieces of legislation that granted subgroups of Native Americans voting rights, but not until 1924 did everybody have that. And yet before this date, there's still high rates of pre-citizenship voluntary service into the military. And going back to World War I, where there have been some studies, when a third of American Indian and Alaska Natives were still not recognized as US citizens, they registered in the military and served in the military. They served as nurses in France and Europe, and they contributed to war efforts through volunteer service in the Red Cross. There's even significant millions of dollars of war bonds that were purchased by Native Americans during this time period. And add to it some of the government policies and laws like conscription and recruitment and drafting. Before citizenship of 1924, there was, for example, this Selective Service Act of 1917 that included Native American men between the ages of 21 and 30 to be drafted regardless of their citizenship status, and very few exempted or applied for deferments on that. And the net effect of that, there's estimates between 20 and 30% of American Indian men served in World War I versus 15% of all adult men. And this is significant, as Raymond will talk about and Regina will talk about too, because of the legacy through intergenerational military service that something like this would create as one, the sons and daughters of these generation of Native American veterans would continue to serve in the military thereafter. One other thing, when we talk about legal services, there's lots of barriers to getting the actual relief sometimes, including military benefits that a veteran should be entitled to. And I just wanted to point out this one thing. There was another act before 1924, the 1999 American Indian Citizenship Act, that purported to give American Indians who served in World War I citizenship. But look at this underlying language. It could be granted if on proof of such discharge and after proper identification before a court of competent jurisdiction and without other examination except as prescribed by said court. Okay, so look at all the levels of proof. You had to provide proof. You had to go into a court. You had to figure out which court it was going to be. You had to probably get legal representation for that. And then you had all these court procedures and additional things. So citizenship wasn't automatically granted. And there were very few veterans that went through this process to become a citizen at that time. So I wanted to point that out. So in terms of numbers of people, it's fairly significant. The statistics have ranged over the last decade or so between 140,000 and 150,000 veterans who are American Indian or Alaska Native, with about 24,000 active duty. Add to it, I have this red part in the middle, which I want to emphasize and then go back to the other points. Veterans' families, when you think about that number of veterans coming back into their communities and the impact that would have on their nuclear and extended family and the community itself, it's a very significant number of people who would be affected by this experience and the issues that fall from it. Also, two other points, the statistics and show that if, for example, looking after September 11th, almost 19% of Native Americans have served in the armed forces compared to 14% of other racial groups or ethnicities. And when we look at women too, the proportion of female American Indian Alaska Native veterans was higher than that of other grouping, 11.3% versus 9% in a recent study. So it's very significant service to this country. Health, we could go on for presentation about health and healthcare disparities, but a couple of points that are related to representation and trauma-informed representation, which Regina will talk about and Raymond will talk about, that the population of people that we're talking about have some disproportionate impacts and manifestations of health issues, including chronic pain, post-traumatic stress, diabetes, hypertension, and pregnancy complications. And one significant number, which is in the middle of this slide, is the rate of PTSD is significantly higher, almost double than other non-Hispanic white members. So this is something to keep in mind when you think about designing programs and working with Native veterans. Okay, as to legal issues, they encounter the same issues that any veteran could encounter, but they may have different needs in terms of how you would do outreach and legal representation. But the benefits issue is a huge one, getting access to lawyers or advocates who can connect them to the benefits that they should be entitled to. This top bullet here about military discharge is one that we're particularly looking at as a potential clinic we might focus on, because there's many that were discharged less than honorably, but for reasons due to mental health, like we see the PTSD part, or military trauma or a sexual trauma, which we can say there could be some disproportionate impacts for people serving in the military on those grounds too. So there's a number of people who are not connected with benefits because of the way and status in which they were discharged, who should be able to review that in an administrative process, but that requires legal representation and outreach to connect lawyers and advocates to those veterans. There's also issues related to decision-making and document drafting and planning. Guardianship is a huge issue, either on a temporary or permanent basis. Some veteran may need assistance in financial decision-making and even healthcare and personal decision-making. And there's lots of legal issues there in terms of taking away that autonomy and maybe needing to restore it, or the competency or effectiveness, a need for accountability of the people acting as guardians as well. This is a very large area of practice for people representing veterans. Doing documents, regular documents and planning, wills and estate planning is important. And of course, for people in tribal communities with kinds of property rights and leases, grazing leases, household leases, allotments, and things like that, there would be some additional steps that would go into the probate process as well. And then, of course, there's an array of basic civil legal issues that would be addressed as well. Since we're on the topic of wellness courts, those typically bring a veteran in or a person in for some kind of a charge or criminal charge, but they're excellent places in which to connect the veteran to other forms of legal assistance as well. When in my work in Dayton, we work with the VA and their justice outreach coordinators who go to our area veterans courts, connect with the veterans, and then they run a legal clinic, which our law students participate in, to go to the VA grounds and connect with the veterans who have these basic civil legal issues that need representation. Okay, so there's lots of programs that exist to provide legal services, and we're canvassing them, and some of you here today may work within them, from legal services and law school, law clinics, private law firms, to courts providing pro se clinics and county and tribal veteran services programs. There's lots of them. And your wellness courts are another source of assistance. But very few of them are focusing on this intersection between veterans and American Indians and Alaska Natives. And so that's what we're looking at, and this is a very high need. There are other, of course, people and entities that are trying to reach this intersection: courts, tribal healing and wellness courts, Veterans Administration personnel, and veteran services representatives and advocates, tribal court advocates, tribal and county veteran services organizations, and even behavioral and mental health programs and caseworkers are trying to connect people to their benefits and their application. So with this, I'm going to transition to the next part and let Raymond and then Regina talk about some of their experiences and their reflections and research related to the experience of veterans coming from that experience into their communities in both directions. Raymond?
Very good. Thank you very much, Andrea, for providing a great overview and leading into this section. I think we can begin by talking about, well, our personal experiences related to military service. For myself, my grandfather served in the U.S. Army cavalry, actually, in the late 1880s. So that was the beginning of my family's participation in the United States military. And he served as a cavalry for about close to 6 or 8 years, I think. And from there, a number of his sons and my uncles participated in the military, also primarily U.S. Army and United States Marines. Uncles who participated in World War II and the Korean War and then the Vietnam War. And so that's some of the history in my family. Can we go back to the first slide, Andrea? Top one. Yeah. And that's been my family's experience with military service on that. And as far as I know, all my uncles and my grandfathers volunteered. When conflicts occurred, they joined and weren't drafted in to the military. Different levels of experiences transitioning out of military into civilian life. Became leaders and leaders in their own rights. Go ahead, Andrea. You don't want to talk about your personal experiences?
Yes. Hi, everyone. I am a veteran too. I joined the military in 1985 at the University of Arizona. I went into the ROTC program and I became a second lieutenant in 1987 and then went active duty for a while. And then most of my time has been peacetime and also reservists. My family is all military except my mom, but yeah, it's a different kind of family that you enter when you join the military. The way that you're trained, the way that you come out, I guess is the way to say it, is you're different. And I have a lot of problems still being a civilian, and it's been a while. I got discharged in 1998. I was an ordnance officer. Back then, I was the only female Native American that I could see anywhere. So I'm interested in finding more from my generation. But yes, it is a very tough situation to transition out into civilian life. Thanks, Ray, for giving me that time.
You went back on mute, Ray.
Move to the next slide, I'm sorry. So the next, my role in this section is to discuss outreach and representation of American Indian Alaska Native veterans and how that is provided and conducted across many parts of Native country. We have some very different processes that are in place related to reaching out to fellow veterans and then having our Native veterans represented at different areas of American society. We're going to have a discussion, presentation really, and maybe discussion later on about this. Is some of the reasons why Native Americans joined. We had a kind of a tip of an iceberg description of that earlier by Andrea. And transition to service, like how Peter described, that transitioning into military service can be across generations actually. Then how military experience ends up impacting Native Americans during the time they're in service, and then that transitioning back to a life with a civilian community. So my part of this discussion is going to be looking at those areas. Next slide, please. One thing that a number of us, one activity that a number of us are working on across the United States among Native American the Native American veteran community is developing and putting forth a Native American Native veteran curriculum that we refer to as Healing the Returning Warrior. This particular set of training workshop modules that we have developed has within it 6 parts. The first part of the first module that we have in the workshop is dealing with how we as natives conduct conflict, how we participate in conflict prior to colonization. And then an overview, like the kind Andrea did on native participation in the contemporary military and how we have participated in that over the centuries. The forgotten or unknown aspects of early Native American military experiences, like I'll use the example of Cortez, who came from Mexico into Arizona and New Mexico. With the stories that he and less than 100 Spanish basically went into the Southwest and basically, quote unquote, conquered tribes that were in the Southwest. The forgotten aspect of that is that, or the untold aspect of that history about Cortez is that he had with him several thousand Native Americans from Mexico in his campaign. So there were actually several thousand Native Americans from Mexican natives who participated in the campaign and ended up settling in the Southwest. And that's been a common experience across Native history from 1500s, 1600s on this way. So those are some things we talk about. The second module deals with prevention. How do we, as Native Americans these days, historically, before colonization, during colonization, how do we prepare ourselves to be word is warriors, I guess, but to be able to conduct ourselves in a conflict situation. These days, how do we prepare ourselves to be resilient as we're getting ready to join the military, Army, Marines, Coast Guard, Air Force, and Navy. What are some things we do today? The third module that we talk about in the series has to do with trauma. There are quite a few studies that indicate that Indians as a population that have more trauma experiences than the general population. And so there are reports that indicate that those trauma experiences tend to be a lot more significant and longer term in impact. But also we have a discussion around historical trauma, which is the intergenerational impact of trauma across generations going back to colonization. And more in a more contemporary setting, how that interacts with a military experience and how that compounds PTSD. There's a good number of our veterans experience not only being in the military, but upon returning to civilian life. Excuse me. The fourth part of the series that we have in training are contemporary approaches to how PTSD trauma is assessed by counselors, therapists, psychiatrists, and psychologists. The kind of treatment that's often available for veterans who are seriously and severely affected by PTSD. There are a number of ways that are developed to begin to moderate the harmful impacts of PTSD. And PBA has put a lot of work, I think, into having stronger sensitivity to American PTSD experiences. The fifth module that we look at, because this is a key part of many of our Native communities, is traditional perseverance and healing practices. Many of our Native nations in the United States, Navajo included, we practice and maintain our traditional ways. We're not Christian, we're not Muslim, we're not Buddhist or Jewish in terms of how we conduct our spiritual practices. Our spiritual practices are what our ancestors practiced, and there are a good proportion of us who continue those ways. But it's also true with a lot of tribes, and they tend to be parallel in concept and learning to Judeo-Christian ways. Traditional approaches are important for us to acknowledge. The majority of Native Americans actually practice traditional healing modalities at one time or another in their lives. There are studies that show that. The sixth module that we have has to do with healing the healer. You know, we have non-veterans who work within the VA system and other parts of a VA helping community at the states and tribal level who work on sensitizing towards how Native veterans and veterans in general can be approached, can be supported, and can be helped in ways that non-veteran providers can be empathetic to. So those are the 6 modules that we have, and we've been doing training on these modules periodically across Native country. So, like this. The reasons Native join the military service. Well, there are a whole lot of reasons. There's just a many of a few. Sometimes it's not just one reason. You know, it can be a menu of things. You know, I joined the military, for example, because there were lack of employment opportunities and lack of training opportunities and education. My family history certainly had a big role in that. Those are probably the 3 primary reasons that I joined the military. Was lack of employment, lack of training, and my family's history of military service. And that seems to be one of the more common themes across Native country. Also wanting to, looking forward to excelling as a soldier. That really drives many of us to join and be as good as or better as our ancestors who joined. And I knew military experiences of my uncles, for example, and would be valuable for me to walk a path that was similar or parallel to their experiences. And why I volunteer for the military. Gina, can you share with us your reasons for joining?
Okay, I think the biggest reason was my family warrior history, because my dad was in the Marines and then the Army. He's a code talker. His name is Thomas H. Begay. And then my older brother joined the military through ROTC too. So he's an officer. And then my other older brother, the same thing. Then my next brother, he joined, he was an NCO IC in Afghanistan, and he's no longer with us. But yeah, that was that. And then also I'm very patriotic to the United States. I love my country, and it comes through when my dad talks about it. And it, also education, it helped with my college degree. So those are some of the reasons. And I was a female, so it was really difficult back in the 1980s for me, in a way, but I kind of grew up with my dad. It was like in the barracks. It was this military style training at home. So it wasn't too much different, and I felt at home sometimes. So those are the reasons I joined.
Thank you for sharing that and giving a good contrast and comparison to the story I share. Next slide, please. Some natives in the military services who have really excelled. Here are the names of three folks who have served in the military and have accomplished a lot. The more recent examples, three members of the Space Force, astronauts, and Air Force. An example of how natives really take on the process of excelling. Being that way. Next slide, please. American experiences. Well, the very common experiences that we have in the military is being referred to as chief. Regardless of whether you're a private or non-commissioned officer or even officers, very common labels that gets attached to Native Americans who join the military. Another common military experience is that many Native Americans who join particularly combat services are volunteer or get volunteered for very difficult duties. They end up doing recon work, even though you may not be specifically trained as a reconnaissance. You get to go out with people, and you get these dangerous assignments and difficult assignments that leadership puts you in because you're Native American. Really common thing that happens with men and women who join the military. And these experiences, of course, vary depending on military assignments. I was trained as a drill artillery, but I often had put in positions of doing reconnaissance and advanced scouting work. And those are some of the things that happen with many of our brothers and sisters who join the military. And these kind of stay with you, that experience, and then you come back out. Next slide, please. In Vietnam, as mentioned before, there are up to 82,000 Native Americans who served in Vietnam. A number of my peers, I graduated in '71, ended up participating in the Vietnam War as it was beginning to end. 90% of Native Americans who served in Vietnam volunteered. That's a really major statistic, piece of information, and higher than non-Native groups. believe that 25% of Native Americans at that time served in the military, primarily Army and Marines. During the Vietnam conflict, we had 226 of our relatives pass. I have an uncle who passed in Vietnam. 5 of our brothers and sisters have also received the Medal of Honor as a result of their bravery and devotion to duty. This also means that it becomes difficult for many Vietnam vets to navigate into civilian life within Native communities. That's been one of the challenges that I hear my brothers and sisters from that era talk about. We have to keep in mind that during the Vietnam era, general American society was very abusive towards members of the military. And that abuse towards the American military during the Vietnam conflict war kind of sticks with Native veterans and from that era. So that's been the things that has happened. Next slide, please. One of the unique features of Native American experiences is that we have a good number of non-national affiliated with veterans organizations across Native countries. Gina is going to talk about this in detail, but for example, under Navajo Nation, we have opportunity to have created among our people 110 different Navajo volunteer organizations in our lands. And I participate in my community's organization in Arizona. A lot of Native tribes have veteran organizations that are specific to the tribes and not affiliated to state or national groups. It's also not uncommon for these tribal groups to become nonprofit and begin to affiliate themselves loosely with veterans of foreign wars of the American Legion. There are some veteran groups on reservations who are directly affiliated as American Legion chapters, for example. The majority of tribes in the United States have tribal government programs for tribal members. Some are very sophisticated, like under Navajo Nation and Choctaw, Cherokee, and a lot of these larger tribes, but some are very good places for veterans to get easier access to tribal services and programs that are out there. We have quite a few women and men who have formed color guards in the United States and Alaska who participate in regional, state, and tribal events, posting colors and also serving as color guards when a fellow veteran passes out. Next slide, please. I should mention that when working with the tribes, it's valuable to know, recognize, and identify which tribal groups are within those reservations and tribal lands or even urban communities and connect with them as a way to outreach. There are some appropriate approaches for legal services when working to deliver those services to veterans. One is to connect with, like I said, existing veterans groups that are out in the community and begin to connect with the commanders and co-commanders, because these veterans organizations have their own military-like structure. Connect with those leaders of the veterans organizations and begin to know how they identify themselves and know how they meet, know the kind of work they're doing by attending meetings and even participating in some of the community events that these veteran groups participate in. And so the organizational structure of veterans and the connection to the tribal government is really key to beginning to approach a way to deliver legal services to Native veterans in Indian country or Native American tribes. And these are some of the special considerations that attorneys and legal advocates really have to keep in mind. Sensitize yourself to what is in tribal community and that relationship tribal community, veteran tribal communities have with state VA organizations. And sometimes it's not that good. Sometimes it can be strong, but there's a continuum of how that relationship can be in terms of communication. And there's some states that really encourage state VSOs, veteran service workers, to go to tribes and make their presence known. And there are some states where they don't look at doing that. And so you have states where state veteran services workers are not having a presence in tribal native country, then there might be cause for animosity towards non-native groups that are trying to come in. So trust and exchanging information, and trust that if you have a negative experience with a tribal veteran group or leadership, this doesn't mean that that is a reason to let go. Having some persistence at figuring out what veterans and veteran groups need, want, and some ways to better collaborate with veteran groups is really key. There's a good amount of persistence that has to be there to be able to have some trust and a relationship develop. Really work at knowing who to contact. Sometimes that may mean more than one visit. There are quite a few tribal communities that are isolated, still relying on postal services. There are also a good number of veterans organizations that have a strong presence on social media and are able to communicate that way. Many of our native lands have restricted or limited access to cell phone services. And these can be some barriers to have to deal with. To access information and working to exchange information with Native veterans. And we have a good proportion of our people, especially the more recently discharged people, who are beginning to have stronger access to those benefits and services that are available through VA and VA-related services. So these are some suggestions on how to things to consider for outreach. Next slide.
Oops. Now we go back to Regina.
Okay,
Sorry.
I'm really grateful for Ray and Andrea, because I'm going to talk about an effort that I was doing in Navajo Nation. I'm going to start with treatment court pilot project. I think what I tried to do more so than create a veterans treatment court was to work on the treatment access. So under DOJ, I wrote a grant. So I hired a veteran, and from there, I'm going to talk about what we were doing, which is the long-term care for veterans in the tribal community. Next slide. So we kind of looked at our wellness model. Restorative justice is kind of like that. We have our 4 directions, and that's pretty much in any tribe, any type of Pueblo tribal program. They have this idea of where you are in the world and how you're situated. And that's true for veterans as well. They have ceremonies for our veterans. There's different things that you do when you come back from war, etc. So we adopted the wellness model for military leaders and families. Next slide. So based on that, our group, our treatment, our care coordinators that I had working with our veterans, we created a logic model. So they participated in that continuum of care model. And we wanted to, one of the things that came up was, we're not just looking at the veteran, we're looking at the families too. And I am a Blue Star mother. My son, Christopher Roanhorse, is the 2nd lieutenant in the Army infantry officer. So now I am a family member of a veteran, and it's a different world when you're a parent of a veteran. Next slide. So I have the logic model. I'm willing to share that, and maybe I can put that in the chat or put it, I think it's already up on the website. But this is a lot of information, but it's practical. If you want to use it to try to develop access to care for veterans, or if you want to use it for sort of a roadmap for your treatment courts, you can certainly use it. Next slide. So working with veterans in developing your treatment court is so important. They're the consumers of the care. And there's a picture of my dad, by the way. They have a wisdom from their own experience, and their journey is different. My journey is different as a Native American female veteran versus what my dad went through. And they have their stories, and they know how they can help other veterans. My dad's always saying, how come you're not a veteran service officer? How come you're not doing this? And he still says that to me. So do include, when you develop your treatment courts, do include the veterans themselves or the family members. Next slide. So this is pictures of my dad, my brother, one of my brothers. The middle picture is a picture of Robertson. He worked for me on this project that we're gonna go through. And then there's a picture of my brother's son, my brother that passed away, his son on the right-hand side, and then my son is on the left-hand side. So that just shows that there's some Native American families, especially in Navajo, that have a lot of veterans in their family. So just focus on consumer-oriented care for your tribe or your program. Remember to be humble to these veterans. They know what they think can help other veterans. And next slide. So that's just a slide about that. And I'm sorry I'm going really quickly, but we're almost towards the end of the hour. The next slide is just about know your government, know what works in your community, like the IHS, the Tribal Behavioral Health Services. Do you have a veterans department? Do you have people in the tribal government that can be like your cheerleaders, your people that can do stuff like legislatively? Those are things you need to know. Also, your healthcare systems. Where are the VA sites? Do you know your Indian Health Service? Next slide. Do you know where they are? Do you know where the clinics are? How can you use that system with the MOU that the VA has with the IHS to try to get more care for PTSD, more care for the families? These are some things that you have to kind of look at with your group and your veterans. Next slide. And a lot of it has to do with access. This is a map of the Navajo Nation. It's huge. There's 5 agencies. There's Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Utah. The IHS people already have systems in place, and they already have an MOU with the VA. So families will go there first. So think about those things when you're trying to develop treatment courts for your judges to understand that, you know, let's use that psychologist, psychiatrist who's connected with the VA, or however you want to do it. Next slide. And then they have prevention programs at IHS. They can do mental health suicide prevention as well. So reach out to them. In 2016, we did reach out to the Navajo Area Indian Health Service mental health program. So we wanted to develop a project where we would get mental health first aid training for veterans who want to be mentors or helpers in the treatment court. That's still in progress. As you know, we went through a pandemic, so it kind of slowed down on the project, but it's still there. Next slide. Go ahead, next slide. If there's, I'm just going to talk about, let me look on my part here. Okay, the Navajo Area Indian Health Service and the VA, they have a MOU. So more than likely within your tribal community, you do have like a way through the VA, through their tribal liaisons, to work with your local Indian health services to get care. It's a lot of money. Over 77 IHS facilities have direct care services to veterans. There's about $75.5 million in reimbursements that go through. This is just on the screen. This is just what you saw on the screen was just the IHS and Navajo Nation. So you kind of have to map that out. But this slide here, it shows you that this MOU with the VA is really important. Military culturally appropriate care needs to be investigated with your local clinics. Next slide. Sorry, I'm going so fast, but some of the things that we did with our veterans to try to engage them and be mentors in our treatment court, if we were going to get one going right away, was we started doing seasonal weekly events to get them to know that there's a justice side to this. There's all kinds of things that you can do with your veterans. We did a breakfast out in Shiprock, and it was pretty awesome. For many years, I didn't really engage my veteran community. I kind of didn't really want to do that. And then all of a sudden, it was awesome how we were doing stuff with our veterans. Okay, next slide. So 2018, we received another grant, but unfortunately it's frozen. But we want to go ahead and move forward to getting peer supports, peer mentors for treatment courts, not just on the reservation, but for off-reservation courts, so that state judges have that resource of veterans who are Navajo or other tribal people to work with their healing to wellness court if they have one there. Next slide. And you know, developing a veterans treatment court in Indian country is very, very complicated. It's a lot of work. But all I can tell you is that it's worth it. There's just photos again of Rob and then my son swearing in, doing his oath. And Ray talked about the veterans organizations. So go out in your community and find them, because they'll be really good peers for the treatment courts. Next slide. We also partnered with our military, we call ourselves a military support group, but these are actually behavioral health professionals from Gallup. A lot of the people here do an annual event because McKinley County is supposed to be the most patriotic county in New Mexico. And so all of these people in this photo are working for different entities, and we used to do a veteran summit and a stand down. And so just know that there are people out there that can continue the work or to be helpers for you. Next slide. And we did benefits, jobs, and health fairs and gourd dances. And these are just a few photos. We engaged our New Mexico Secretary of the Veterans Affairs. So there's other things you can do like virtual runs. Oops, my timer went off. So next slide. I think I'm pretty much done though. This is just a slide about the virtual run during the pandemic. Next slide.
You're okay, Regina.
Am I?
Yeah.
And then these are just photos of gatherings that we've done in our project. And you can see there's a lot of people that you can engage in developing your treatment courts or your programming. Next slide. And then we also did veteran summits way out on the res, way out there by Chinle, Arizona. So these are some photos. It was pretty awesome getting out to the community. Next slide. And then there's also the planning. So the photo on the left is a picture of the big Navajo Nation most of the judicial branch, probation, and I think social services and behavioral health services, we did a training, strategic planning. This is called the Dene Action Plan. Next slide. So it can go into planning. And then these are just photos of the online stuff that can happen, which is Navajo Nation Division of Behavioral and Mental Health Services actually have videos of resiliency, of culture, programming, sensitivity. If you want to go visit it, go on Facebook because they still have those videos up. Next slide. And during the pandemic, they still did it. So this is just a photo of the awesome people at Behavioral Health Services. Vera, John, TJ, they still were at the point of, we still want to outreach to veterans. Next slide. And I think that's pretty much my portion, or let's see, I think the legal assistance needs as actually the biggest part of this whole cake. We really need to outreach to pro bono attorneys and legal service organizations to help our veterans get the benefits that they need to be service connected disabled or to get into the system. Next slide. And then best practices, like I said, just get a trauma-informed judge. Your judge has to understand the restorative justice process, and that's off reservation too. I would say LISW can do evaluation right on the spot. And so peer support, we really need to get our veterans involved, attend a veterans meeting, and then plant a seed. Next slide. Key points in developing legal services. There are some tribal sponsored programs. The hard part about it is connecting the veterans with these programs. It is rural out there. There's 4-wheel drive country. Time. I mean, like right now on the res, it's $4 a gallon for gas. These are really big challenges for our veterans on the reservation, but we're going to continue, right, Andrea and Raymond? We're going to do it. We're going to see something within the next year. Next slide.
I think that's
There we go.
I think that's the end of the content. We have a few minutes for questions, and we have a review and evaluation for you to fill out. I apologize for the 2 times I went off. My slides jammed for some reason. I couldn't advance them. So I will, I want to get you to the next slide so you can do the QR code, because I feel like when I touch the screen, even to look at the chat, it jams up. So I'm going to do that. And then I think I see a question coming up. If somebody else wants to read the question, that would be great. And otherwise, maybe I was going to ask Ray if you had, or Regina, if you had anything else that you wanted to tie up. We kind of like jumped quickly from you, Ray. So if you had a last point as well, but let me go to the QR code and you guys could be looking at that and figuring that out. If you want to fill that out while we see if there's any other questions. Do we have any questions as a starting point, and then any last wrap up from Raymond and Regina?
Andrea, I'm not seeing any questions. What was put in the chat was the link to the evaluation.
Okay. Great.
Raymond and Regina, is there any last points you'd like to make before we wrap up?
I just want to extend my appreciation to everyone for being with us today and giving us this opportunity to describe the content that we had to share. Thank you.
And I just want to thank Andrea and the National American Indian Judges Association for their support of this effort, because it's really important for our families and our veterans to get the services that they need. And the challenges that we face as American Indian Alaskan Natives is really true. There's so many barriers at the beginning of this century. And now look at where we are. We have very, very understanding and important people out there that can help. So if you guys need me to do a presentation or you want more information, my information is on the PowerPoint and it's going to be uploaded into the website. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. And thank you to you, Angie and Chelsea and Abby for helping to organize this. I also wanted to note Elton Naswood, who, and you're probably on the presentation here, but he's spearheading with Naija. He's spearheading this particular project. So any questions or information you have, you could also direct his way. It's a very nice project. Regina and Raymond could give days of presentations on all aspects of outreach, representation, culture, trauma-informed representation. And of course, there are numerous days and hours of discussions we could have about legal services and how to better arrange them or how to supplement them. But we really appreciate your participation. Is there another question in the chat? No? Okay. So thank you so much for your time and for your attention, and have a good rest of your day.
Yes, thank you, Andrea, for the history and the background of Native American and Alaska Native veterans information that you gave at the beginning. And to you, Regina and Raymond, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us and your personal experiences. So much appreciated. And thank you again for all of that. So everyone who's still with us today, thank you for attending today's webinar, which was the overview of legal issues and support for Native American and Alaska Native veterans. Have a great day, everyone. If you do think of something that we can help you with, I will put my email address in the chat, or you can email tlpi@wellnesscourts.org and be happy to get whatever information you might need. So that is it for today. Thank you. See you for tomorrow's webinar. Have a great day.